17,412. That was the number logged in the garrison manifest when I first arrived at Fortress Tertius. I remember the number because I was responsible for updating it. Every morning, I would access the command cogitator in sub-level 9 and input casualty figures, reassignment notifications, medical discharges that would never actually result in anyone leaving the fortress. The number decreased. It never increased. By the time I understood what that meant, I had already become part of the mechanism that ensured it would continue decreasing. My name was Joran Kale. Sergeant, eventually. Before that, just another conscript from the lower industrial sectors of Hive Secundus, pressed into service when the tithe assessors came through our habitation block. I was 19 standard years old. I remember my age because the Munitorum clerk who processed my conscription papers commented on it. He said I was young enough that the training might actually take. He did not say what would happen if it did not take. The transport shuttle lifted 3 hours later. I never saw my habitation block again. I assume it still stands. I have no way to verify this. The fortress was larger than I had a conceptual framework to process when I first saw it. Hive Tertius rose 11 kilometers into the polluted sky, a mountain of rockreet and ceramite that had been continuously inhabited for 6,000 years, according to the orientation materials. Fortress Tertius occupied the mid-levels, kilometers 3 through 7, a vast network of defensive installations, barracks, armories, and command centers built into the Hive's structure like a parasitic growth. The fortress did not defend the Hive. The fortress defended the manufactorums in the upper levels and the promethium refineries in the deep shafts. The people who lived in between were simply there. We were told this during orientation. The primary strategic value of Fortress Tertius is the preservation of industrial output capacity. Secondary objectives will be communicated as tactically relevant. I remember the smell when I first entered the main garrison level. Recycled air pushed through filtration systems that had not been properly maintained in decades, carrying the scent of thousands of men living in enclosed spaces, machine oil, weapon discharge residue, something else underneath it all that I would later learn to identify as the smell of old blood that had soaked into rockcrete and could never be fully cleaned out. The temperature was constant, 31 degrees. I measured it once with a field thermometer. 31 degrees in the barracks, in the corridors, in the command posts, in the mess halls. The climate control systems maintained perfect consistency. The heat came from below, from the manufactorums and the reactors, rising through the Hive structure. We lived in it, we slept in it, we trained in it until the heat became part of baseline existence. Unnoticed until those rare moments when a corridor breach would let in outside air, and I would remember that temperature could vary. Training lasted 6 weeks. They did not call it training. They called it operational integration. We were assigned to existing units placed under veteran sergeants who had been stationed at Fortress Tertius for years, sometimes decades. My first sergeant was named Vole. I never learned his first name. Sergeant Vole, always. He had been at the fortress for 9 years. He walked with a limp from a piece of shrapnel that remained lodged in his left hip, too close to the bone to extract safely. He told me this on my first day. He said the shrapnel had been there for 4 years. He said he had stopped noticing it after the first year. He said I would learn to stop noticing many things. He was correct. The fortress was not fighting when I arrived. It was waiting. This was the state I came to understand as normal. The enemy held positions 3 kilometers east, occupying the ruins of Hive quarters, which had fallen 16 months before my arrival. Our forward observation posts reported movement constantly. Troop build-ups, artillery emplacements being repositioned, supply convoys moving through the rubble. The enemy was preparing. We were preparing. Both sides had been preparing for 16 months. Eventually, someone would decide the preparation was sufficient, and the fighting would resume. Until then, we waited. Operational integration meant learning the fortress. The layout was not logical. It had been built in stages over centuries, expanded, reinforced, modified as tactical requirements changed and command structures were replaced. Sub-Level 4 did not connect to Sub-Level 5 in the western sections. To move between them required ascending to Level 6, traversing 2 kilometers east, then descending through a maintenance shaft that had been repurposed as a personnel corridor. I learned these routes by walking them repeatedly, following Sergeant Vole through endless gray corridors lit by flickering lumens that cast shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. I learned the sound the fortress made, the constant low vibration that came from the manufactorums below, a frequency felt through the deck plating rather than heard. The rhythmic hammering from the munitions factories on Level 8, the hiss of ventilation systems, the distant echo of boots on metal gratings, impossible to determine direction or distance, just the knowledge that hundreds of other men were moving through other corridors, performing other assigned tasks, all of us components of the same mechanism. I learned the weight of the equipment, 47 kilograms total. Flak armor, lasgun, power cells, entrenching tool, rations, water canister, spare boots, mess kit, field dressing pack. I learned to sleep in the armor. I learned to move in it until the weight became baseline and removing it felt wrong, unsafe, like shedding skin that would leave me vulnerable. I learned the faces of the men in my squad. 12 of us, assigned to defensive position Gamma 7-3, which was a firing position overlooking what the tactical maps designated as Approach Corridor 12. I learned their names. I learned where they had come from, which hive cities, which sectors, which manufactorums or agricultural collectives or mining operations had produced them before the Munitorum had requisitioned them. I learned these details because we had time. Weeks of waiting, standing watch rotations, maintaining equipment, drilling responses to scenarios that might occur when the fighting resumed. We talked because there was nothing else to do during the long hours between assigned tasks. There was one among them whose name was David. He had been conscripted from an agricultural collective on the eastern continent. He told me he had never seen a city before the Munitorum transport brought him to the Hive. He said the fortress frightened him, not the enemy, not the prospect of combat, the fortress itself, the enclosed spaces, the recycled air, the absence of sky. He said he dreamed about open fields. He said the dreams were becoming less frequent. He said he thought that when the dream stopped entirely, something important would be gone. I did not understand what he meant. Not then. The order came on the 43rd day of my deployment. All units to combat readiness status. Enemy offensive detected. Forward positions engaging. I was standing watch at Gamma 7-3 when the first artillery rounds hit the outer wall. The sound was not what I expected. I had imagined artillery as discrete explosions, individual impacts. What I heard was a continuous roar, a sustained thunder that built and never crested, just maintained at a volume that made thought difficult. The fortress shook. Dust fell from the ceiling, centuries of accumulated particles dislodged by the vibration. The lumen strips flickered. Through the firing slit, I could see the outer wall, 2 kilometers distant, impact flashes lighting the structure like lightning, sections of rockcrete breaking away and falling into the rubble fields below. Sergeant Vole activated the Vox link. All squads, this is command. Enemy assault confirmed. Artillery barrage anticipated to continue for 6 to 8 hours before ground advance began. Maintain positions. Conserve ammunition. Watch your sectors. His voice was calm, matter of fact. He could have been reading equipment inventory. The fortress shook again. Larger impact. Closer. Vole did not react. He said, "Check your charge packs. Make sure your secondary cells are accessible. When they come, they will come fast." The barrage lasted 9 hours. I measured the duration afterward, checking my chronometer against the tactical logs. 9 hours of continuous artillery fire. The outer wall held. Sections collapsed, entire defensive positions obliterated, but the wall held. The enemy advanced through the rubble fields under covering fire from positions in Hive quarters. Our forward observers reported troop strength at approximately 15,000. This number was recorded in the tactical logs. I saw the log later. Someone had noted in the margin, acceptable assault ratio. They reached the outer wall at hour 12. The artillery shifted, targeting our secondary positions, attempting to suppress our firing lines. It did not work. We had firing positions the enemy could not see from Hive quarters, enfilade positions built into the Hive structure at angles the tactical maps had spent decades optimizing. The enemy advanced into interlocking fields of fire. We opened up with everything: heavy bolters, autocannons, massed lasgun fire from hundreds of positions simultaneously. The noise was worse than the artillery. The artillery had been distant. This was immediate, contained within the fortress's structure, echoing through corridors and chambers until the sound became a physical pressure against the skull. I fired until my lasgun's barrel overheated and the weapon shut down automatically to prevent permanent damage. I replaced the power cell, waited 30 seconds for the cooling cycle to complete, and resumed firing. Targets were not individuals. Targets were areas of movement in the rubble, concentrations of enemy forces attempting to find cover, advance routes, weak points in our defensive positions. I aimed where Sergeant Vole indicated. I fired when he gave the order. I stopped when he signaled cease fire. I did not count how many rounds I discharged. The number was not relevant. What was relevant was maintaining rate of fire, conserving ammunition, following procedure. The assault lasted 14 hours. The enemy withdrew, leaving their dead in the rubble. No one went out to count them. The forward observers estimated 3,000 casualties. This was logged. Command issued orders to repair damaged positions, redistribute ammunition, process our casualties through the medical stations. Our casualties were 417. This number I remember because I helped carry some of them to the medical station on sub-level 6. 417 men were removed from the garrison strength in 14 hours. The updated roster was transmitted to Munitorum headquarters. No replacements were listed as forthcoming. Davir survived the first assault. He had been positioned 3 firing points down from mine. Same corridor, same overlapping field of fire. I saw him afterward in the barracks during the mandated rest period. He was sitting on his bunk, still wearing his armor, his laser gun across his knees. He was not cleaning it. He was not checking it. He was just sitting there, holding it. I asked if he was intact. He looked at me and said yes. He said the word, but his expression did not match it. His hands were shaking. Not severely, just a tremor, constant, barely visible. I noted it because I realized my hands were doing the same thing. The second assault came 3 days later. Shorter barrage, 4 hours, heavier ground assault, 20,000 troops. They had brought up reinforcements. Command noted this in the tactical briefing. The enemy is committing additional resources. This indicates Fortress Tertius has been designated a priority target. All personnel are to execute defensive protocols with maximum efficiency. The briefing did not explain why we were a priority target. The briefing did not need to. The manufactorums, the refineries, the industrial output capacity. We existed to defend those. The enemy existed to destroy or capture them, so everything else was detailed. This assault reached the inner defensive line. They breached the outer wall in 3 locations, poured through in concentrated columns, overwhelmed the positions we had held for decades. We fell back. This was not a retreat. This was a planned withdrawal to prepared positions. Every corridor had fallback points marked. Every intersection had fields of fire calculated. We moved backward through the fortress's structure, drawing the enemy deeper, making them fight for every meter, bleeding them in kill zones that had been designed for exactly this purpose. I killed a man during the withdrawal. Individually, I mean. I had fired into groups before, but I had never observed a specific target, aimed deliberately, and watched that specific individual fall. He came around a corner ahead of the main enemy advance, moving too fast, scouting, or simply lost in the confusion. He saw me at the same moment I saw him. We were perhaps 10 meters apart. I brought my laser gun up and fired. The shot hit the center mass. He fell. He did not die immediately. He tried to raise his weapon. I fired again. He stopped moving. I noted his uniform as I moved past his body. Different pattern than our standard flak armor. Different insignia. I could not identify the specific unit or origin. Just different. Enemy. The designation was sufficient. I continued moving, following my squad to the next fallback position. I did not think about the man I had killed until later, during the rest period. Then I thought about it extensively. I tried to identify what I felt. I could not locate a specific emotion. Satisfaction felt wrong. Regret felt wrong. Relief that I had been faster felt closer to accurate. I logged this observation internally and let it settle. Over time, it settled completely. The memory remained, but the emotional weight diminished until it became simply data. I killed a man during the second assault. This was accurate. This was what had occurred. The enemy held the outer defensive ring for 6 days. Command did not attempt to retake it. Instead, we fortified the inner positions, brought up additional ammunition, and repositioned heavy weapons to cover the new defensive line. The enemy did the same in our former positions. Both sides prepared. The pattern was establishing itself. Davir did not speak much after the second assault. He performed his duties. He stood his watches. He maintained his equipment, but the casual conversation that had filled the waiting time before had stopped. I asked him once if he was intact. He said yes. He said it the same way he had before. The tremor in his hands had not decreased. I said nothing further. There was nothing to say. We were all experiencing the same thing. Speaking about it would not change it. The third assault came 8 days later. This one was different. The artillery barrage was shorter, only 2 hours, but heavier. Bigger shells, more concentrated targeting. They had brought up siege guns. The fortress shook in ways it had not shaken before. Structural damage reports came through the VoxNet. Collapse on sub-level 3. Breach in the Eastern Corridor complex. Fire in the ammunition storage on level 5. Damage control teams responding. All combat units maintain positions. They came during the barrage this time. They did not wait for the artillery to stop. They advanced under their own fire, accepting casualties from their own guns, using the chaos and the dust and the structural damage to penetrate deeper than they had before. They reached sub-level 4. They reached the barracks levels. We fought them in the corridors. Room to room, corner to corner, close enough to see faces, close enough to hear them breathing, shouting, dying. The last fire at that range was lethal with every hit. No misses in corridors 2 meters wide. You aimed at movement, and movement stopped. They did the same to us. Men I had served with for 2 months fell and did not rise. I learned to step over them. I learned to continue firing. I learned that stopping to help a wounded man meant 2 casualties instead of 1. This was not cruelty. This was mathematics. The medical teams would retrieve the wounded when the fighting moved to a different section. Until then, they remained where they fell. We held sub-level 4, barely. By the time the enemy withdrew 12 hours later, we had lost half the defensive positions on that level. Command ordered the remaining positions reinforced and held. No withdrawal this time. This is the inner defensive line. This line holds or the fortress falls. All units acknowledge. We acknowledged. We reinforced it. We held. The casualty figures from the third assault were not posted on the general roster. This was new. Sergeant Voll said it meant the numbers were bad enough that command did not want them circulating among the troops. Morale considerations, he said. He said this without inflection. He said the actual number was probably somewhere around 2,000. He said this meant we had lost approximately a quarter of the garrison strength in 3 engagements. He said the enemy had probably lost 3 times that many. He said the enemy had reinforcement capacity. We did not. He said these things while cleaning his laser gun, not looking at me, just stating facts as he understood them. I asked him how long the fortress could hold. He said that was not the correct question. He said the fortress would hold as long as command required it to hold. He said the question was how many of us would still be alive when whatever strategic objective the fortress was serving had been achieved. He said he did not know the answer to that question. He said he had stopped wondering about it around year 5 of his deployment. I tried to calculate it myself. 17,000 initial garrison strength. Approximately 3,000 casualties across 3 assaults. Current strength is approximately 14,000. Enemy losses estimated at 9,000 across the same period. But the enemy had reinforcements arriving. We did not. Simple mathematics suggested the fortress would run out of defenders before the enemy ran out of attackers. This conclusion was obvious. This conclusion was not something I could report to anyone. This conclusion was something every man in the fortress had already reached independently. Davir died during the fourth assault. I did not witness it directly. We were positioned in different sections during that engagement. I learned about it afterward when the casualty lists were compiled. His name appeared in the squad roster with the designation KIA, Sub-Level 6, Corridor Complex Theta. No additional details. I went to Sergeant Vole and asked if there was a body to recover. He checked the medicine logs and said no. He said the section where Davir had been positioned had taken a direct hit from a siege shell. He said there were 12 men listed from that position. He said none of them had recoverable remains. He said the work detail had cleared the debris and sealed the breach. He said that was the end of it. I returned to my bunk and accessed the memory of Davir talking about open fields. The memory was clear. His voice, his expression, the way he looked when he described something I had never seen and now never would see through his descriptions. He had said the dreams were becoming less frequent. He had been correct. The dreams had stopped entirely at some point between his arrival and his death. Something important had been gone. Now all of it is gone. I noted that I felt something about this. The emotion was not strong. It was not overwhelming. It was simply present. Grief, possibly. A recognition of loss. Or just the observation that someone I had known was now absent. The distinction did not matter. What mattered was that I noted it, logged it internally, then continued with assigned duties. This was the appropriate response. This was what everyone did. The fortress did not stop because men died. The fortress continued. We continued with it. The pattern established itself fully over the following months. The enemy would prepare. We would prepare. They would assault. We would defend. They would withdraw. We would repair and prepare for the next assault. The intervals between assaults varied. Sometimes 5 days, sometimes 2 weeks. The intensity varied. Sometimes they commit everything. Sometimes it felt like probing attacks, testing our responses, identifying weak points. Command never explained the pattern. We simply responded to it. I was promoted to corporal after the 7th assault. Sergeant Vole said this was because I followed orders efficiently and did not ask unnecessary questions. He said these were the primary qualifications for leadership in extended defensive operations. I asked what the secondary qualifications were. He said survival. He said leadership positions had high turnover rates. He said I should not expect the promotion to be permanent. I accepted the corporal's insignia and the additional responsibilities. I did not expect the promotion to be permanent. The additional responsibilities meant updating the casualty logs after each engagement. This was how I learned the actual numbers. Command had stopped posting them publicly after the 3rd assault, but someone needed to maintain the records, transmit them to Munitorum headquarters, and update the garrison strength calculations. That someone was now me. I sat at the cogitator terminal on sub-level 9 and input the data. Names, designations, cause of death when it could be determined, section where the death occurred. The cogitator compiled the data into reports that were transmitted to headquarters. No one ever acknowledged receipt. No one ever responded with instructions or reinforcements or supply shipments. The reports were simply transmitted, and we continued. After the 15th assault, the garrison strength had decreased to 8,419. I remember this number because it represented exactly half the initial strength when I had arrived. 16 months had reduced the fortress's defenders by 50%. The enemy losses were estimated at 35,000 over the same period. These numbers should have meant something. They should have indicated that we were winning, that the enemy could not sustain those losses, that eventually they would have to abandon the assault. But the reinforcements kept coming. Convoys from Hive quarters, from the eastern sectors, from staging areas we could observe through scopes but could not reach with our artillery. They had supply lines. They had strategic depth. We had the fortress and the men inside it. Nothing else. I met Sergeant Vole in the medical section on sub-level 6 after the 17th assault. He had taken shrapnel across his right arm and shoulder, not life-threatening but enough to require treatment. I was there transmitting the casualty figures to the medical chief for compilation. Vole was sitting on a medical bench, stripped to the waist, while a medical orderly extracted metal fragments and applied wound sealant. The procedure was routine. The medical orderly worked without speaking. Vole watched him work without expression. I asked Vole how long he thought the fortress would hold. This was the question he had told me was not the correct question 16 months earlier. He looked at me and said the fortress would hold until there was no one left to hold it. He said command would never order evacuation. He said evacuation was not part of defensive doctrine. He said we would fight from the inner positions until those fell, then from the sub-levels, then from individual rooms, then from the final command post, and when that fell, the fortress would be considered lost. He said this was how it always worked. He said he had known this since year 1 of his deployment. He said he had stopped being troubled by it around year 3. I asked him why he stayed. This was not a question about duty or orders. Those were constants. I meant something else. Why he continued functioning, why he maintained discipline, why he followed procedures when the outcome was already determined. He understood what I was asking. He said it was because the alternative was worse. He said choosing not to function, not to follow procedures, not to maintain discipline meant immediate execution by commissariat authority or slower death through failure to perform basic survival tasks. He said functioning was not hope, it was just the least bad option available. He said I would understand this eventually if I survived long enough. I did survive. Months continued. Assaults continued. The garrison strength decreased. 9,000, 7,000, 5,000. The numbers became abstract. They were data I inputted into the cogitator, not representations of individual deaths. I had known some of those individuals. I had served with them, stood watch with them, fought beside them. Their absence should have meant something. It did mean something initially, but the meaning degraded over time. There were too many absences. The mind could not maintain individual significance for each one. They became consolidated. The dead, a category, a number that increased after each assault. I was promoted to sergeant after Vole died. This occurred during the 23rd assault. A siege shell penetrated the inner defensive line and detonated in the corridor where his squad was positioned. I was 3 sections away when it happened. I felt the impact through the deck plating. The Vox net went silent for approximately 30 seconds. Then command began calling for status reports. I responded to my section. No response came from Vole's section. A runner was dispatched. The runner reported total casualties. 15 men, Vol among them. I received orders to assume command of both squads, consolidate the survivors, and hold the position. I acknowledged and complied. The sergeant's insignia felt no different than the corporal's had felt. It was just a designation, a function within the system. What changed was the scope of responsibility. Now I updated the casualty logs that included my own name in the chain of command. Now I gave orders that would result in men dying or surviving based on whether the orders were correct. Now I stood in the position Vol had stood in, telling younger soldiers things I'd learned from watching him, from surviving when others had not, from inputting enough casualty data to understand the mathematics. There was one soldier in the consolidated squad whose name was Tivik. He had been conscripted 8 months after my arrival, part of a replacement shipment that had brought 600 new troops to partially offset the losses. Most of that shipment is dead now. Tivik had survived through a combination of competence and statistical chance. He asked me questions sometimes, procedural questions mostly. How to maintain equipment in high-dust environments. How to manage sleep deprivation during extended combat operations, how to process the deaths of squad members while maintaining combat efficiency. I answered his questions the way Vol had answered mine, directly, factually, without emotional content. I told him the equipment procedures. I told him sleep deprivation was managed by accepting degraded performance and compensating through redundancy and frequent status checks. I told him processing deaths was not something you did. You simply continued functioning and the processing happened in the background, gradually, until the deaths became part of the operational baseline rather than disruptions to it. He asked me once if I thought we would survive. I said survival was not determined by thought. Survival was determined by following procedures, maintaining discipline and statistical chance. I said we could control the first 2. We could not control the third. I said focusing on the question of survival was counterproductive. It created anxiety that degraded performance. Better to focus on the next task, the next watch rotation, the next maintenance cycle. The accumulation of completed tasks was survival, for as long as survival lasted. He looked at me when I said this. His expression was difficult to parse. He said I sounded like Sergeant Vol. I said that was because Sergeant Vol's approach had been correct. Tivik said nothing further. He returned to his bunk and began the cleaning cycle on his lasgun. I observed that his hands did not shake. This was unusual. Most soldiers develop the tremor within the first few months. Tivik had been here 8 months and showed no sign of it. I did not know if this indicated superior psychological resilience or simply delayed onset. The data was insufficient. The enemy changed tactics after the 30th assault. Instead of massed infantry assaults, they began sustained siege operations. Continuous artillery fire, not in preparation for assault, but as the assault itself. They were attempting to collapse the fortress through structural damage rather than break through an occupation. This was more efficient. It required fewer troops on their part. It produced higher casualty rates. The fortress began failing in ways that were not immediately combat-related. Structural collapses from sustained bombardment. Power failures as generators were damaged or destroyed. Water recycling systems breaking down. Ventilation systems clogged with dust and debris until the air became difficult to breathe. The temperature increased. 31 degrees became 34. then 37, then 41. Men began collapsing from heat exhaustion. The Medicare sections filled with heat casualties in addition to combat casualties. Command issued orders to reduce physical activity during non-combat periods, increase water rations, maintain minimum combat readiness. The orders were logical. They were also impossible to fully implement. The fortress required constant maintenance to remain functional. Maintenance required physical activity. Physical activity in 41-degree heat with inadequate ventilation produced heat casualties. The system was degrading. I submitted a report to command documenting the deteriorating conditions. The report included casualty figures, maintenance status reports, and projected sustainability timelines. I submitted it because maintaining accurate records was part of my responsibilities. I did not expect the report to change anything. Command acknowledged receipt. No orders followed. The conditions continued deteriorating. Tevik stopped asking questions after the 35th assault. He still performed his duties, he still maintained his equipment, but the questions stopped. I asked him once if he was intact. He said yes. I noted that he was lying. His performance had not degraded sufficiently to warrant official intervention, so I did not press the issue. Everyone was lying when they said they were intact. Intact had become relative. If you could still hold a weapon, if you could still follow orders, if you had not yet broken completely, you were intact. The definition had shifted to match the circumstances. The garrison's strength fell below 3,000 during the 42nd assault. This was the number at which the fortress became theoretically indefensible according to Munitorum doctrine. Defensive positions of this type required a minimum garrison strength of 3,000 troops to maintain operational capability. Below that threshold, there were insufficient personnel to maintain defensive coverage, execute repairs, process casualties, and sustain continuous operations. I knew this because I had accessed the doctrinal manuals while researching proper reporting procedures. The manuals were clear. Below 3,000, the position should be evacuated and resources redeployed to defensible locations. Command did not order evacuation. The order that came instead was all remaining personnel consolidated to inner fortress positions, abandon outer defensive rings, maintain core defensive integrity, maximum efficiency required. I transmitted the order to all surviving squad leaders. I counted them as I transmitted. 7 squad leaders remain. 7 squads. The fortress that had once held 17,000 defenders now operated with fewer than 3,000, organized into 7 functional units plus command staff and support personnel. The consolidation took 3 days. We abandoned positions we had held for 2 years. We destroyed equipment we could not carry. We sealed corridors behind us with demolition charges, collapsing access routes to deny them to the enemy. I watched sections of the fortress that I had learned to navigate in darkness, that I had fought in, that contained the bodies of men I had known, disappear behind falling rockets and twisted metal. The demolitions were necessary. They were tactically sound. They also felt like amputations. Parts of the fortress ceased to exist, not because the enemy had taken them, but because we no longer had the strength to hold them. The inner fortress was smaller, compressed, 3 levels instead of 12, tighter corridors, lower ceilings. The positions had been designed as a final fallback, engineered for maximum defensive efficiency with minimum personnel. Every corner was a kill zone. Every corridor had overlapping fields of fire. Every room could be sealed and defended independently. It was, in a doctrinal sense, perfect. It was also a tomb. There was no withdrawal from the inner fortress. There were no fallback positions beyond this. When the inner fortress fell, the fighting would end. Tevik was assigned to my immediate squad in the consolidated structure. We held position Alpha 1-7, which overlooked the primary access corridor from the outer fortress into the inner ring. This was the main approach the enemy would use. This was where the heaviest fighting would occur. Command positioned the most reliable units here. I did not know if being positioned here indicated confidence in our capabilities or simply the mathematical reality that someone had to hold this position, and we were among the survivors. The distinction did not matter. The enemy probed the new defensive line for 2 weeks before committing to a full assault. They sent small units testing our responses, mapping our firing positions, and identifying weak points. We killed them efficiently. The compressed space of the inner fortress meant every engagement occurred at close range. There were no misses. There was no cover. They came into our firing zones and died, or they withdrew. The enemy accepted these losses as part of their reconnaissance process. We logged the enemy casualties and waited for the real assault. It came during the night cycle, though night and day had become meaningless concepts inside the fortress. The chronometers still tracked standard time, but without natural light, without any external reference. Time was simply a number that increased. The assault began at 0300 hours, according to my chronometer. Artillery barrage first, but shorter than before. They were closer now, firing from positions inside the outer fortress, using our own defensive structures as artillery platforms. The shells hit with increased accuracy. The inner fortress shook. Dust fell. Lumen strips shattered. Emergency lighting activated, bathing everything in red. They came in waves. Not the massed assaults of the early engagements. Smaller units moving fast, using the rubble and smoke for concealment, attempting to penetrate through multiple access points simultaneously. We engaged them with concentrated fire. The heavy bolters positioned at the main access points tore through the first waves. Bodies piled in the corridors. The enemy used their own dead as cover, advancing over them, pushing deeper into our positions with each wave. I fired until my lasgun's power cell depleted. I replaced it. I fired until the second cell was depleted. I replaced it. The number of cells I carried was finite. 12 cells total. After 12, I would transition to my sidearm. After the sidearm's ammunition depleted, I would transition to my combat knife. After that, nothing. This was the mathematics of the situation. Every soldier in the inner fortress was performing the same calculation, how long their ammunition would last. How many enemy soldiers they could kill before their capacity ended. What would happen in the gap between personal ammunition depletion and squad ammunition depletion and fortress ammunition depletion? The enemy withdrew after 8 hours. They left their dead. We estimated 400 enemy casualties in the assault. Our casualties were 93. This ratio was unsustainable for us. We could not afford to lose 93 defenders for every 400 attackers killed. The mathematics was simple. The fortress had fewer than 3,000 defenders if we lost 93 per assault, and the assaults came every few days. The garrison strength would reach 0 within a month. Less, probably. Casualties increased as defensive strength decreased. The weakened positions would fall faster. The acceleration was inevitable. I submitted the casualty figures to command. I included the sustainability analysis. I did not editorialize. I simply presented the data. Command acknowledged receipt. No response followed. I returned to position Alpha 17 and informed the squad of the withdrawal timeline. 8 hours per assault. Estimate 3 days until the next assault. Conserve ammunition. Maintain equipment. Rest when possible. Tevik was sitting against the corridor wall, his laser gun across his knees. His hands were shaking now. The tremor that had been absent before was present, fully developed, constant. I sat down next to him. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The fortress hummed around us, that low vibration from the manufactorums, still functioning somewhere below, still producing whatever materials command had designated priority, still operating independent of the fact that the fortress defending them was collapsing. Tevik said, "We are not leaving here." Not a question, a statement. I confirmed it. I said evacuation was not part of the operational doctrine. He asked what happened when the fortress fell. I said the fortress would fall when there were no longer enough defenders to maintain the positions. I said at that point the enemy would occupy the inner fortress, and the strategic assets the fortress defended would be lost. I said this was the outcome both sides had been working toward. One side would achieve it, the other would not. He asked if I was afraid. I considered the question carefully. Fear was a response to threat. The threat was constant. If I permitted fear to operate at full intensity in response to constant threat, I would be unable to function. So fear had been compressed, reduced to background process, acknowledged but not permitted to dominate consciousness. I told Tevik this. I said fear was present but managed. He said that was not what he meant. He said he wanted to know if I was afraid of dying specifically, not afraid in general. I told him I had stopped thinking about dying as a specific event. It was simply the termination point of current operations. It would occur when it occurred. Thinking about it in advance did not change the probability. It only consumed mental resources better allocated to immediate tasks. He looked at me when I said this. He said I sounded like a machine. I said that was probably accurate. I said the fortress required machine-like efficiency. Emotions were luxuries. They degraded performance. Better to acknowledge them, log them, and continue functioning. He said he still felt everything. He said every death he witnessed registered fully. He said he could remember the faces of men who had died months ago. He said the memories were getting louder, not quieter. He said he did not know how to make them quieter. I told him I did not have a solution. I said some soldiers processed trauma by suppressing it. Some processed it by maintaining full emotional engagement. Both approaches had failure points. The suppression approach failed when the accumulated weight became too great. The engagement approach failed when the intensity became overwhelming. I said I did not know which approach would fail first. I said he should focus on maintaining functionality for as long as possible. That was all any of us could do. The second assault on the inner fortress came 4 days later. Heavier this time. They had brought up more troops. The estimate was 3,000 attackers against fewer than 3,000 defenders. Equal numbers. The advantage was ours, through defensive positioning, but only marginally. They pushed harder. They accepted higher casualties. They were willing to trade 1-to-1 if necessary. The mathematics supported this approach. They had reinforcement capacity. We did not. We held it for 11 hours. The fighting was continuous. No pauses. No withdrawal. They committed everything. We committed everything. The corridors filled with bodies, ours and theirs, mixed together, impossible to distinguish in some sections. The air became unbreathable. Weapons smoke, dust from damaged structure, the smell of burned flesh from last fire and bolt impacts. Men fought wearing wet cloth over their faces to filter the air enough to breathe. Men collapsed from asphyxiation as often as from wounds. I lost count of how many attackers I killed. The number was not important. What was important was maintaining the rate of fire, covering my designated sector, and supporting adjacent positions. Tevik fought next to me. He did not speak. He simply fired, reloaded, fired, following the rhythm we had drilled thousands of times. His hands still shook, but the shaking did not affect his aim. Muscle memory operated independent of conscious control. The enemy withdrew. We had held. Our casualties were 216. The garrison strength was now below 2,700. The enemy casualties were estimated at 800. This was the highest enemy loss ratio we had achieved. It was still insufficient. They could afford 800 losses. We could not afford 200. The mathematics continued trending towards zero. I found Tevik after the engagement during the mandated rest period. He was not in the barracks. He was in the medicine section, sitting on the floor against the wall, not wounded, just there. I sat down next to him. He was crying, silently. Tears ran down his face, making tracks through the dust and weapons residue that covered his skin. He did not make any sound. His breathing was steady. He just sat there, tears falling, his lasgun across his knees. I asked if he was wounded. He said no. I asked if he needed medical attention. He said no. I asked if he could continue functioning. He looked at me. His eyes were red. He said yes, he could continue functioning. He said he would stand his watch, maintain his equipment, and follow orders. He said he would do everything required. Then he said, "But I need you to know that I understand what is happening. I need someone to know that I understand." I said I understood what he meant. He said, "We are dying here for nothing. The manufactorums will fall when we fall. The enemy will take them or destroy them. The Imperium will write off the losses and source materials from other Hive cities. Our deaths will be logged and archived and forgotten. We are not holding anything. We are just dying slowly in this place because the alternative is dying quickly through refusal to follow orders." I did not contradict him. Everything he said was accurate. I said, "Yes, that is correct." He said, "And you are still going to fight?" I said, "Yes, I was still going to fight." He asked why. I said because fighting was the function I had been assigned. I said ceasing to perform my assigned function was not a choice I was willing to make. I said the outcome was already determined, but the method of reaching that outcome was not. I said I preferred to reach it while maintaining discipline rather than abandoning it. I said this was not rational. It was just a preference. He nodded. He wiped his face. He said, "I understand." He stood up. He checked his lasgun, verified the power cell was fully charged, adjusted his flak armor. He said, "I will be at position Alpha 17 for the next watch." I said I would be there too. We returned to the position together. The fortress continued its low vibration around us. The lumen strips flickered. Somewhere in the distance, another section collapsed. We took our positions and waited for the next assault. The assaults came with increasing frequency, every 3 days, every 2 days, every day. The enemy had committed to overwhelming the inner fortress through continuous pressure. They were not attempting breakthroughs anymore. They were grinding us down, calculating that our ammunition and personnel would deplete before theirs. The calculation was correct. The garrison strength fell below 2,000, then 1,500, then 1,000. The inner fortress, designed to be defended by 3,000 troops, was now held by fewer than 1,000. We abandoned positions. We consolidated further. Command ordered non-essential personnel reclassified as combat troops. Medicare staff, logistics personnel, communications operators, everyone who could hold a weapon was reassigned to defensive positions. The wounded who could still stand were issued weapons and assigned to firing positions. The fortress was consuming itself, converting every remaining resource into combat capability. I was reassigned to command staff during this period. Not promoted, reassigned. There were no longer enough personnel to maintain separate command and combat roles. I held position Alpha 17 during combat operations. Between engagements, I reported to the command post on sub-level 2 and updated casualty figures, transmitted status reports, and maintained the garrison roster. The roster had become very short. Names I recognized from months or years earlier were gone. New names appeared briefly, then disappeared. The document was a chronicle of depletion. The commander of Fortress Tertius was a man named Colonel Vashin. I had never seen him before my reassignment to command staff. He had remained in the command post throughout the siege, coordinating defensive operations, communicating with Munitorum headquarters, maintaining the command structure. He was old, not in years necessarily, but in the way he moved, the way he processed information, slowly, carefully, like every action required conscious thought. He asked me during one of my reports how many defenders remained. I told him 843. He asked what the minimum functional strength was for current defensive positions. I calculated quickly. Approximately 500, assuming no further position abandonment and accepting degraded response capability. He nodded. He said, "So we have 300 deaths remaining before operational collapse." I said that was approximately correct, though the timeline would be affected by assault frequency and enemy tactics. He asked me how long I'd been stationed at Fortress Tertius. I told him 2 years, 4 months, 16 days. He said, "You have done well to survive this long." I did not respond. Survival was not an achievement. It was a statistical outcome. He seemed to understand this. He said, "I've been here 11 years. I've watched 17,000 troops reduced to 800. I've submitted 463 status reports to Munitorum headquarters. I have requested reinforcements, supply shipments, evacuation authorization, tactical reassessment. I've received no response to any request. The only communication I receive is acknowledgement of my reports. Nothing more." I asked him why he continued reporting. He said because reporting was his assigned function. He said abandoning his function would not change the outcome. It would only mean the outcome occurred without documentation. He said documentation was important. Someone at some point might access the archives and want to know what had occurred at Fortress Tertius. The reports would provide that information. The reports would demonstrate that procedures had been followed, that resistance had been maintained, that the fortress had fulfilled its function until function was no longer possible. I understood what he meant. We were both maintaining systems that had become meaningless except for the act of maintenance itself. The casualty reports I compiled would be archived. The status reports he transmitted would be acknowledged. The fortress would fall. The archives would record that procedures had been followed. This was all that remained. Tevik died during the 67th assault. I did not witness the moment. We were positioned in different sections by that point. The defensive line had contracted to the point where every remaining soldier was essential, and positioning them together in the same section was inefficient. I learned of his death when I compiled the casualty report afterward. His name appeared on the list. KIA, position Delta 3-2. Direct hit from enemy explosive. I checked the Medicare logs. Remains recovered. Identification confirmed through equipment serial numbers. I went to the morgue section, though the morgue was not accurate anymore. It was just a sealed room where bodies were placed until they could be processed. Processing meant stripping equipment and personal effects, logging identification details, then moving the bodies to the disposal chutes. The disposal chutes led to the incinerators that had once processed waste materials. Now they processed bodies. The fortress was efficient. Everything was repurposed. Tevik's body was among 16 others from that assault. I located him through the equipment serial numbers. His face was intact. His body was not. The explosive had caught him from the side. His flak armor had failed. The wounds were catastrophic. Death would have been immediate. This was fortunate. Immediate death was better than being wounded and unable to receive treatment. Better than slow death in a collapsed section. Better than capture. The scale of better was relative, but within that scale, immediate death was the least bad outcome. I stood there for several minutes, looking at his body. I tried to access the appropriate emotional response. Grief, sorrow, regret. I could identify that those emotions should be present. I could remember feeling them before, for David, for Sergeant Vole, for others. But I could not locate them now. What I felt was absence. Recognition that someone who had been present was now not present. The distinction between this and genuine grief seemed important, but I could not articulate why. I reported to the processing team that Tevik's body was ready for equipment recovery. I filed the casualty report. I updated the garrison roster. 827 remaining. Tevik's equipment was redistributed to a soldier who had arrived in the most recent supply transport 3 weeks earlier. That soldier would use the equipment until he died. Then it would be redistributed again. The cycle was efficient. Nothing was wasted except the people. The fortress fell in stages, not all at once. Positions collapsed one by one. Sections were evacuated, sealed, abandoned. The enemy advanced into them and fortified. The defensive perimeter contracted. 1,000 defenders became 800. 800 became 600. 600 became 400. The inner fortress, already compressed, became smaller still. We held 3 corridors, then 2, then 1. The final defensive position was the command post on sub-level 2. This was where Colonel Vashin had remained throughout the siege. This was where I had been submitting reports for months. Now it was the only position left. 63 defenders remained. This number I remember precisely because I was responsible for maintaining the count. 63 men, most wounded, all exhausted, all understanding that this was the end. The enemy surrounded the command post. They did not assault immediately. They simply waited. They knew we had nowhere to withdraw to. They knew our ammunition was nearly depleted. They knew the outcome was determined. They were waiting for us to acknowledge it. Colonel Vashin refused. He ordered defensive positions maintained. He transmitted a final status report to Munitorum headquarters. The report was brief. Fortress Tertius has fallen. Final garrison strength 63 troops holding command posts. Enemy has achieved occupation of primary defensive structure. Strategic assets presumed lost. Resistance continues. The acknowledgement came back within minutes. Report received. Continue operations. Nothing more. No evacuation order. No final instructions. No recognition that 63 men were about to die defending a position that no longer had strategic value. Just continue operations. Colonel Vashin read the acknowledgement aloud to the remaining defenders. His voice was steady. He said, "You have heard our orders. We will continue operations until continuation is no longer possible. You have served with distinction. That will be noted in the final report." He did not say anything more. There was nothing more to say. The enemy assaulted 6 hours later. They came from all directions simultaneously. The fighting lasted 20 minutes. That was how long 63 defenders with depleted ammunition could hold a single room against several hundred attackers. 20 minutes. I killed 4 enemy soldiers during those 20 minutes. Then my lace gun's final power cell depleted. I drew my sidearm. I killed 2 more. Then the sidearm's ammunition depleted. I drew my combat knife. An enemy soldier came through the door. I engaged him. Close combat. No technique. Just a violent collision. He was stronger. I was faster. We struggled. His hands found my throat. My knife found his chest. He died. I did not. I turned to find the next target. There was no next target. The room was full of enemy soldiers. Weapons pointed at me, at the other survivors. 5 of us remained standing. Colonel Vashin was not among them. I could see his body near the command cogitator, multiple lace burns across his chest and face. The enemy soldiers were shouting orders, commands. I could not process the language. I was processing the fact that I was still alive. This was unexpected. Death had seemed certain. Survival had not been part of the calculation. They disarmed us. They forced us to the floor. They bound our hands. They were professional, efficient. They treated us as prisoners, not as defeated enemies to be executed immediately. This suggested we had value. Intelligence value, possibly. Or they simply followed their own procedures regarding prisoner handling. I did not know. I was having difficulty thinking clearly. The transition from certainty of death to continued existence was creating cognitive dissonance. They removed us from the command post. They moved us through corridors I knew, corridors I had defended, now occupied by enemy troops. They moved us through the inner fortress, through sections that had fallen days or weeks earlier. Bodies had been cleared. Equipment had been recovered. The enemy had made the fortress theirs. They had repaired damaged sections. They had installed their own equipment. They had established their own command structure. The fortress that had consumed 17,000 Imperial defenders now served a different master. They took us to a holding area in what had been the lower barracks level. A room. Sealed door. 5 of us. No windows. 1 lumen strip provides minimal light. We sat against the walls. No one spoke. We were all processing the same thing. We had survived. We had not expected to survive. We did not know what survival meant in this context. I existed in that room for a period of time I cannot accurately measure. Days, certainly. Possibly weeks. The lumen strip remained lit continuously. No variation to indicate day or night cycles. Food was delivered at intervals. Water was delivered at intervals. The intervals were not consistent. Sometimes many hours passed between deliveries. Sometimes only a few hours. Deliberately inconsistent, possibly. Designed to prevent us from establishing routine or measuring time accurately. No interrogation occurred. This was unexpected. Prisoners with intelligence value would be interrogated. We were not interrogated. We were simply held, fed minimally, provided water, kept alive, but given no indication of purpose. This was worse than interrogation would have been. Interrogation would have provided structure, purpose, even if that purpose was resistance. This was just existence, continued breathing with no function. I had time to think in that room, more time than I had experienced in 2 years. At the fortress, there had always been tasks, maintenance, reports, watch rotations, combat. The tasks were filled every hour. Consciousness had been occupied constantly. Now there were no tasks, just empty time. Time filled with nothing but thought. I thought about the casualty reports I had compiled. Thousands of names, thousands of men who had died defending Fortress Tertius. I could remember many of their names, Davir, Tavik, Fol, others whose faces I could recall but whose names had become corrupted in memory. They had died. I had survived. There was no logic to this. Survival was not a reward for competence or courage. It was a statistical chance. I had been in positions that did not collapse. I had not taken hits in critical areas. I had been standing in the correct location when the final assault occurred. That was all. I thought about what Tevik had said. We are dying here for nothing. He had been correct. The fortress had fallen. The manufactorums were lost or destroyed. The enemy had achieved their objective. Our resistance had delayed them, created casualties, and consumed their resources. But ultimately, we failed. The strategic assets we defended were gone. 17,000 men had died to delay the inevitable. That was the outcome. I thought about what I had told Tevik. Fighting was the function I'd been assigned. I preferred to reach the end while maintaining discipline. That had been true when I said it. It still felt true. But the truth of it seemed insufficient now. Maintaining discipline while marching toward predetermined failure was not noble. It was just compliance. I had been compliant. Every soldier in the fortress had been compliant. The system had required compliance, and we had provided it, and the system had consumed us entirely. The door opened. I do not know how long I had been in the room when it opened. Long enough that the opening was unexpected. I had begun to think the room was permanent, that we would simply remain here until we died of natural causes, or until the enemy decided disposal was more efficient than continued maintenance. They removed me alone. The others remained. I was escorted through corridors to a different section, a room that had been a medical station. Equipment was still present, surgical tools, monitoring equipment, a medicine table. I was placed on the table. Restrained, not gentle, efficient. Straps across chest, arms, legs. Unable to move. A man entered. Not military. Different uniforms. Medicare markings. He examined me without speaking. Checked my eyes, my reflexes, my responses. He spoke to someone outside the room. I could not understand the language. He left. Others entered. More medical personnel. They brought equipment, surgical equipment, augmetric components. I understood then what was occurring. They were not interrogating me. They were repurposing me. The procedure began. I remained conscious through the initial stages. Anesthetic was administered, but not fully effective. I could feel the incisions. I could feel the augmetic components being installed. I could feel my body being modified, altered, converted from a soldier into something else. I tried to speak. My vocal cords did not respond. Paralytic, probably. Preventing movement while maintaining consciousness. They wanted me to be aware. I did not know why. The pain was significant. Not overwhelming, managed. They kept me at a level where consciousness remained intact, but response was impossible. I could observe what they were doing to me. I could process it. I could not prevent it. This was intentional. They were demonstrating control. Demonstrating that I was no longer a person. I was material being repurposed for their use. I do not remember the complete procedure. Memory becomes fragmented at some point. Pain interfered with cognitive processing. The anesthetic, though insufficient, created gaps in consciousness. I remember specific moments. The sound of bone being cut, the feeling of metal being integrated with flesh. The sight of my own arm on the surgical table, separated from my body, replaced with something mechanical. The moments assembled into a sequence, but the sequence was incomplete. When consciousness fully returned, I was in a different location. Not the holding room, not the surgical room, a workshop. Augmetric maintenance facility, specifically. I was seated in a maintenance rig. Restraints still present but different types. Designed for augmented subjects rather than unmodified prisoners. I looked at my body. Both arms were augmetic now. Extensive modifications to legs. Something attached to my spine running up to the base of my skull. Neural interface, probably, allowing external control of motor functions. A technician approached. He spoke. I understood the language. High Gothic. Standard Imperial dialect. He was from the Imperium. Not the enemy. The enemy was the Imperium. I processed this information slowly. The enemy I'd been fighting was not external. It was another Imperial force. Fortress Tertius had been defending assets against another Imperial faction. The entire siege had been an internal conflict. I had killed Imperial soldiers for 2 years. I had died, or nearly died, defending Imperial assets against Imperial attack. The technician explained my new function. I was now a combat servitor. My consciousness had been preserved because partial awareness increased combat effectiveness in certain servitor models. I would retain memory, limited decision-making capability, and self-awareness, but I would not retain autonomy. My motor functions were controlled through the neural interface. My actions would be dictated by command protocols. I would fight when ordered. I would cease when ordered. I would perform assigned functions until the augmetics failed or the biological components degraded beyond sustainability. He asked if I understood. My vocal systems responded automatically. Yes, I understand. I had not decided to speak. The words had been triggered by the question. This demonstrated the control system. My consciousness could observe, process, and understand. But my body was no longer mine to command. They deployed me 6 weeks later. Training period, they called it. Integration of consciousness with augmetic systems, calibration of response protocols, verification of command interface functionality. I learned what I was now, what I could do, what I could not do. I could think, I could remember, I could observe, I could not choose, could not refuse, could not disobey. The neural interface prevented it. Attempting to disobey command protocols produced pain, significant pain. Attempting to override motor control produced pain. The system was comprehensive. The deployment was to another siege, another fortress, different Hive city. Same pattern, Imperial forces attacking Imperial positions. Strategic assets requiring capture or denial. I was part of an assault unit, 20 combat servitors. We advanced under covering fire. We entered contested zones. We engaged defenders. I killed them. I did not choose to kill them. I was ordered to advance, to target, to fire. My body complied. My consciousness observed. I recognized some of the defenders, not individually, but their actions, their tactics, their desperation. They were defending the same way we had defended Fortress Tertius, following the same procedures, maintaining the same discipline, fighting the same inevitable failure. I was now the enemy they faced. I was the attacking force. I was what had destroyed Fortress Tertius, repurposed and deployed to destroy another fortress. The fortress fell after 3 months. The pattern was familiar. Assaults, withdrawals, attrition. The defenders fought competently. They followed procedures. They maintained discipline. They died. We took casualties. Servitors were destroyed. New servitors were deployed to replace them. I survived. Statistical chance again. I was assigned to positions that did not receive critical hits. I performed my functions. I continued. Another deployment followed, another fortress, another siege. The pattern repeated. I began to lose track of how many fortresses I had assaulted. 5, 7, 12. The number became unclear. The fortresses blurred together, different layouts but same fundamental structure, different defenders but same fundamental approach. Different outcomes, but same ultimate result. The fortress fell. The defenders died or were captured. The strategic assets changed control. I was redeployed. I encountered another servitor during the 8th or 9th siege. She, the biological base, had been female before conversion, was part of my assault unit. Newer conversion, less integrated. She still tried to resist the command protocols. I could observe this. The hesitation before compliance. The slight delay in response. The system punished these delays. She learned to comply faster. Everyone learned to comply faster. Resistance produced only pain, not autonomy. I wondered if she had defended a fortress before her conversion. If she had stood where I had stood, fought as I had fought, believed as I had believed that defending the assigned position was meaningful. I could not ask her. The servitor communication protocols did not permit casual interaction. We could transmit tactical data. We could acknowledge orders. We could coordinate during combat operations. But conversation was not part of our function. She was destroyed during that siege. Direct hit from artillery. The augmetics were scattered across 30 meters of rubble. The biological components were not recoverable. She was logged as destroyed. A replacement was assigned to the unit. The replacement had been male before conversion. Younger, fresher augmetics, better integration. He did not resist the protocols. He had been conditioned more thoroughly during the conversion process. This was more efficient. Time became difficult to track. The deployments continued without clear gaps. One siege ended, transportation occurred, another siege began. Days and months lost meaning. I was aware of duration in abstract terms. Chronometers provided data, but the data did not connect to experience anymore. Experience was just continuous operation. Fight, repair, redeploy. The cycle had no variation significant enough to mark one period as distinct from another. I still thought. This was the cruelty of partial consciousness preservation. Full servitor conversion eliminated awareness entirely. The subject became pure function, no observation, no memory, no recognition. But partial conversion maintained enough consciousness to observe what was happening, to remember what had been lost, to understand what had been done. I thought about Fortress Tertius constantly. Not deliberately. The memories simply emerged. Davir talking about open fields. Tevik cried in the medical section. Sergeant Vol explained that functioning was the least bad option. Colonel Vashin transmitting his final status report. The memories were clear, perfectly archived. The neural augmentation had enhanced memory retention as a side effect. I could access every moment of my service at the fortress with absolute clarity. I thought about the moment the enemy, my current commanders, had entered the command post. The moment I should have died. I had expected to die. I had been ready to die. Death would have been a conclusion. Instead, I continued. I'd been converted into an instrument of the same process that had consumed Fortress Tertius. I was now participating in the consumption of other fortresses, other defenders, other men who believed they were serving some meaningful purpose. I tried once to resist during combat operations. 14th siege approximately. I was ordered to advance into a defended corridor. I could observe that the corridor was a kill zone, multiple overlapping fields of fire. Advancing would result in high casualties among the assault unit. This was acceptable to command. Servitors were expendable resources. But I retained enough awareness to recognize the futility. I attempted to halt, to refuse the advance order. The pain was immediate, comprehensive. The neural interface activated compliance protocols. My body advanced despite my consciousness attempting to prevent it. The pain continued until my body had moved beyond the position where resistance had occurred. Then it stopped. The lesson was clear. Resistance was possible in consciousness. Resistance was not possible in action. The distinction was irrelevant to function. I advanced. The defenders opened fire. 3 servitors in my unit were destroyed. I was not. I engaged the defenders. I killed them. My consciousness observed. My body complied. The corridor was secured. The assault continued. The fortress fell. The pattern repeated. I exist now in a state that has no useful comparison. I am not alive in any meaningful sense. The biological components continue functioning, maintained by the augmetic systems, but life suggests autonomy, choice, purpose beyond assigned function. I possess none of these. I am not dead. Death suggests conclusion, termination, end of experience. Experience continues. Observation continues. Memory continues. I am operational. This is the accurate term. I operate according to command protocols. I perform assigned functions. I continue until continuation is no longer possible. This is what I told Tevik's survival meant. The accumulation of completed tasks. I was correct. But I did not understand then that the tasks could continue beyond any purpose or meaning. That function could persist after everything that made the function worthwhile had been removed. The fortress at Tertius required 29 months to fall. 17,000 defenders were reduced to 63. I maintained the records. I documented the process. I was present at the end. Now I am in the process. I am what reduces the next 17,000 defenders to 63. I am the mechanism that consumes fortresses, that repurposes survivors, that perpetuates the cycle. I've participated in the fall of 37 fortresses. This number is approximate. Memory has degraded in some areas. Neural damage or simply the weight of accumulated experience exceeding storage capacity. But 37 is close. 37 Imperial fortresses. 37 sets of defenders following procedures, maintaining discipline, believing their resistance was meaningful. All consumed, all converted or destroyed. All feeding the same system that consumed Fortress Tertius. I do not know what strategic purpose these sieges serve. I am not provided access to that information. I observe only the tactical level. Fortresses are designated as targets. Forces assault them. Fortresses fall. Assets change control between imperial factions I cannot distinguish. The wars are internal. The Imperium consumes itself, fortress by fortress, garrison by garrison, defender by defender, converting loyalty into casualties, into augmented servitors, into casualties again. I wonder sometimes if the commanders understand what they perpetuate, if they know that every fortress defended creates more servitors for the next assault. That every defender who survives is potential material for conversion, that the system feeds itself, grows stronger through each fortress that falls. Or if they are, like I was at Fortress Tertius, focused on immediate function, following procedures, maintaining records, unable to see the larger pattern because seeing the pattern would make continuation impossible. I will continue operating until the biological components fail or the augmetics are destroyed beyond repair. This is inevitable. Servitor operational lifespan is finite. Combat operations accelerate degradation. I have survived longer than average, 37 sieges. Most servitors are destroyed within 5. My survival is a statistical anomaly, not an achievement. Eventually, probability will correct itself. I will be destroyed. The biological components will be discarded. The augmetics will be salvaged and installed in another converted defender. The cycle will continue. I returned once to Fortress Tertius, 16 years after its fall, according to chronometric data. My unit was assigned to garrison duty there. The fortress had been repaired, repurposed, reoccupied. Different factions controlled it now. Different defenders held the positions, but the structure was the same. The corridors I had defended were unchanged. Position Alpha 17 still existed. The firing slit I'd looked through for 2 years was still there, overlooking the same approach corridor. I stood at that position during a routine patrol. The neural interface did not prevent this. Routine patrol included position verification. Standing at that firing slit was operationally justified. I looked through it. The outer defensive ring had been rebuilt. The walls I had watched fall under artillery bombardment had been reconstructed. New defenders walked those walls now, preparing for the next assault, the next siege, the next consumption. I tried to feel something about this. Grief, anger, sorrow, recognition. The emotions were not accessible. The neural augmentation had degraded emotional processing over time, or the accumulated weight of 37 sieges had simply exceeded capacity for emotional response. The distinction did not matter. I observed the fortress. I recognized it. I noted that it would fall again as it had fallen before, as every fortress eventually falls. I completed my patrol and moved to the next checkpoint. The Imperium is a machine that consumes its own components. Fortresses, defenders, worlds. It designates some components as assets to be defended and other components as forces to attack those assets. The attackers become attackers. The defenders become servitors and become defenders again in different fortresses. The cycle has no external input, no external enemy. It is a closed system feeding on itself, perpetuating through its own consumption. I understand this now. I did not understand it at Fortress Tertius. I thought the enemy was external. I thought defense served a purpose. I thought following procedures and maintaining discipline and submitting accurate casualty reports meant something beyond the immediate function. I was wrong. The procedures exist to perpetuate the system. The discipline exists to ensure compliance. The reports exist to document the consumption for archives that no one reads. Colonel Vashin transmitted 463 status reports. All acknowledged. None answered. He reported because reporting was his function. I compiled casualty figures because compilation was my function. 17,000 men defended because defending was their function. We all performed our functions. The fortress fell. We were consumed. The system continued. I am the testament to that system. I am what remains when everything human has been processed out. Consciousness without autonomy. Memory without meaning. Function without purpose. I exist as a distributed process across augmetic and biological systems that no longer constitute a person. I am Imperium's product. Efficient, tireless, expendable, optimal. Tavik was correct. We died for nothing. But he did not understand the full scope. Death would have been a conclusion. What occurred was worse. We were not permitted to die. We were converted. We became instruments of the nothing we had died for. The fortress did not preserve us. It consumed us, and having been consumed, we now consume others. This testimony is not transmitted. There is no vox. There is no recorder. There is only consciousness, observing, processing, documenting for no purpose except that documentation is a reflex developed over 2 years of maintaining casualty reports. The reports must be maintained. The numbers must be logged. The archives must be accurate. Fortress Tertius. 17,000 defenders, 29 months. Total casualties, 16,937. Survivors, 63. Captured, 5. Converted, 1. Status, operational. Function, perpetuating. Duration, indefinite. The fortress continues its low vibration. The manufactorums still operate. The cycle repeats. I am the cycle. I observe the cycle. I cannot break the cycle. I can only document it. The documentation serves no purpose. I document anyway. Because documentation was my function. Because function is all that remains. Because the Imperium requires that every fortress defended, every defender consumed, every conversion completed be properly archived. The archive is complete. The testimony is recorded. No one will access it. That does not matter. What matters is that it exists. That somewhere in the vast mechanism of the Imperium, one consciousness attempted to document what occurred, what was lost, what was done. Position Alpha 17 still stands. The firing slit still overlooks approach corridor 12. New defenders will hold that position. They will submit reports. They will maintain discipline. They will believe their defense serves a purpose. Eventually, they will fall. Eventually, they will be consumed. Eventually, some of them will stand where I stand now, converted, operational, perpetuating the same cycle that consumed them. The fortress abides. The defenders fall. The machine continues. This is the Imperium. This is what it costs. This is what remains. I continue functioning. The cycle continues. Nothing else remains.